I just want to say that I had prepared this paper, and only at the last minute did it occur to me that I could embellish it with some visuals. The paper does not depend on them at all, for example, as this morning's lecture did. But I think it will add what I would call some atmospherics to what I'm talking about, and certainly won't hurt at all, although some of those images may be a bit puzzling, and some may be very fuzzy because they're all sort of third-hand Xeroxes of black and white images from 1944, 45. So, but anyway, so that is going to be interpolated in due course. So in 1944, as victory against Nazi barbarism came into view, thinking about the post-war intensified in the camp of these three Allied democracies, Britain, the United States, and what, for the moment, let us call France combattante, resisting France, la France résistante. After the war's carnage and its devastations and its upheavals, which of course were starkly different in these three nations, as Alan anticipated for me, most citizens would look forward simply to getting back to a normal, familiar existence. But this desire for normalcy clashed in some quarters with a conviction that meaningful victory could on no account bring a return to pre-war normalcy. Three more or less contemporaneous manifestos embodied this transformational spirit in the three nations. Now, each arose obviously from a distinct historical context. Each was elaborated without any apparent influence from the others, either direct or indirect. Yet, without question, they converge. And I think they should be regarded as three national variations on a common progressive vision at that historic moment. So I would like to put each of these programs into context, briefly summarize the essential and largely similar content of each, note the particularities of each as well, and suggest their importance for the coming post-war experience. For me, these manifestos have been one portal into this larger comparative project on the domestic aftermaths of World War II in the three Allied democracies. I'm going to start with France simply because the manifesto in question came first chronologically. It relates to the Conseil National de la Résistance, the CNR, which was established in occupied France in 1943 and achieved two major breakthroughs. First, it melded a variety of autonomous resistance movements inside France to the extent, at least, of giving them a common umbrella for themselves. And the CNR brought together then delegates from 8 of these organizations, North and South, along with representatives from what the CNR called 6 former political families: the communists, the socialists, the radicals, the social Catholics, and from the center-right, the Fédération Républicaine, nuance Louis Marin, that might mean something to the scholars in the 20th century, and the Alliance Démocratique, nuance Reynaud. There's no need to elaborate on that. So you have the 8 resistance organizations, the 6 political families, and then also delegates from the 2 trade unions, all of which had been banned by Vichy. I meant the 2 trade union federations, the CGT and the Christian trade union. Now, the 16-man council, which gave a prominent place to the communists, thereby achieved a new level or threshold of unity for the resistance. Not complete, not thoroughgoing, not all-inclusive, but substantial. But secondly, the CNR formally conjoined this diverse internal resistance with de Gaulle's Free French, or Free France, France combattante, in London and Algiers. The CNR, in fact, was prodded into being by de Gaulle's personal emissary, Jean Moulin. And each side needed the other. De Gaulle's legitimacy increased substantially when a more unified resistance would acknowledge his leadership of a future provisional government for the liberation. Conversely, as he forged this entente with the CNR, the general bound himself unambiguously to its democratic values, whereas initially, as you probably know, Free France had just essentially been patriotic and military, and it, for a while had tried to remain apolitical, although that was not really possible. When the Nazis in Vichy were defeated, a relatively unified resistance expected to lead a national movement of renewal. Now, this is, as I say, the atmospherics. These are some of the clandestine newspapers put out in the first top four by resistance groups, and then two of the clandestine political organizations, the socialist and the communist. We have no pictures of the clandestine CNR that I know of. They may well exist, but they're not common. But after the liberation, images of the CNR became very common, and I give you here two of what I think are two of the better images. The top one is not of the CNR itself, but three of the figures there, second from the left, center, and far left, were three of the important members of the CNR. And then the CNR lingered on for a while, and this is an actual meeting that's taking place. With, again, notice the man holding the paper there, and he's there in the middle in the top one. Just keep this individual in mind. We'll come back to him briefly. But in any case, the CNR then sort of comes into its own with the resistance. Now, with the liberation, excuse me. The CNR was, of course, clandestine. So as a practical matter, its full 16-man council rarely met, and a 5-man bureau coordinated most of its activity. But the bureau communicated back and forth with the network of the full range of delegates, and this was quite an effective procedure. Now, despite an increasingly brutal repression in 1943-44, it was a good time to begin thinking about the post-war. Victory was, in a sense, already in sight. It was before the chaos that D-Day would bring, and it just seemed appropriate to various organizations involved with the resistance to start talking about and thinking about the post-war. But none of these efforts gained the standing or traction that the CNR manifesto would win, and they entirely lacked the resonance that it had in post-liberation France. So we now come to the CNR manifesto itself. A sketch for an economic and social program for the post-war was launched by the underground of the socialist resistance group, published in a clandestine newspaper, and put before the CNR. Between July 1943 and March 1944, the CNR argued about over this document, over this, what was the proposed second part of its common plan or plan of common program or plan of action. It had to have a first part which involved, and it was called the immediate plan of action, to deal with the mobilizations, particularly the military mobilizations for the coming military confrontation by the resistance within France, and the management of the rolling liberation that would follow upon D-Day, including the local liberation committees. The second part of the program, measures to be applied after the liberation of the territory, sketched the post-war vision of the CNR. And it was extremely influential because, in the end, the full council of the CNR unanimously approved the final draft, despite earlier reservations by several members. And this produced a consensus that is perhaps unique in French political history. And now, in this CNR program, once de Gaulle's provisional government took over, the first orders of business would be specific to the occupation. and Vichy, and including the punishment of traitors, the purge of active collaborators, and that sort of thing, and eventually, at the proper time, the restoration of democracy via universal suffrage. But the CNR program insisted that at the same time a series of reforms must eliminate les grandes féodalités économiques et financières, and that France must institute a veritable economic and social democracy. Now here, notwithstanding a peculiarly French idiom, we encounter the perspective common to progressives among all three allies. So the CNR program calls for a rational organization of the economy that will assure the subordination of particular interests to the general interest, and it also calls for the intensification of national production along the lines of a plan established by the state. Beyond this widely shared notion of state planning and economic intervention, the CNR also called for nationalizations without quite using the word. Le retour à la nation des grands moyens de production monopolisés. Specifically, energy, coal mining, insurance companies, and large banks were specified in the manifesto. Now, the call for nationalization almost derailed a consensus. For the Socialist Party, nationalization had been of key financial and infrastructure sectors was a long-standing goal in the interwar period. But on the CNR, first of all, two delegates from the two conservative Republican parties that I mentioned, Joseph Laniel and the surrogate for Louis Morin, objected to the idea of nationalization initially, as did the communists, because the communists had shown little enthusiasm for nationalization in France in the past. They insisted that nationalization would create islands of socialism in a sea of capitalism, and that public ownership or nationalization of a few sectors was an insufficient reformist palliative. But various resistance organizations, the newer forces, so to speak, eventually weighed in and put pressure on the CNR to include this, to incorporate this as part of their post-war vision for the future. They were freer of inherited political positions and believed that this would be a vital part of the renewal that everyone ostensibly was demanding. The tide turned in particular when Pierre Villon, a respected and extremely effective communist clandestine organizer, swung his support behind the idea of nationalization and helped win over the full unanimous approval by the 16-man council. Now, beyond the notions of state planning and nationalization, the CNR enshrined the notions of security and dignity as the principal goals of post-war social policy. So this included a fairly predictable list of things that you might expect: the right to work and job security, in the French sense of the right to work, going back to 1793, indeed, a minimum wage that would be sufficient, independent trade unions with substantial roles. This eventually becomes the Comité d'entreprise. A complete plan of social security, guaranteeing everyone the means of existence regardless of adverse circumstances, policy to promote the well-being of farmers and farm workers, cooperatives, and there was a mention of access to appropriate levels of education regardless of financial means. So that, in a nutshell, it's a fairly concise program to begin with. I'm making it more concise. That is the CNR vision, formal, unanimously adopted by the 16-person council, and that's manifesto number one. At this point, I propose to look at the United States, again for reasons of chronology, because it in that sense comes next. Here's how I will introduce this to you. In November 1943, as that month came and went, a man named Chester Bowles was worried. He was an advertising executive and New Deal enthusiast who had joined the war effort in 1941 as the director of the Connecticut district of the OPA, the Office of Price Administration, the wartime bureaucracy that supervised rationing and price control. In July 1943, President Roosevelt had persuaded him to head the beleaguered agency in Washington, where he quickly mastered its political and administrative quicksands. But it was not the relentless challenges of running the OPA that troubled Bowles. It was the next presidential election. We were worried that FDR would not run in 1944, Bowles recalled in an oral history, although he admitted that the odds seemed that he ultimately would do so. But more to the point, Bowles and his circle in the administration fretted over the prospective re-election campaign and the fate of the New Deal. As grand strategy and war-related issues totally absorbed Roosevelt, these individuals started looking over the horizon to victory and the post-war. They remembered that the New Deal had only cushioned the Depression's devastating effects and had not really cured what he called an inoperative, poor working economy that still left 8 million people unemployed in the U.S. on the eve of disarmament. Rearmament. I seem to be getting everything backwards here. He felt, and his friends in the administration felt, that new life for the New Deal was incumbent lest America revert to what he called that old, stagnant, half-baked economy. Now, Bowles had good access to Roosevelt, and he sent a memo to the president right before FDR's departure for the Tehran conference in December 1943 with Churchill and Stalin. He urged Roosevelt on this trip abroad to visit various units of American troops during that trip, and to then give a speech when he returned to Washington along the following lines. And now I'm going to make a rather long quote from his oral history. This was the speech his memo proposed to Roosevelt. Roosevelt would come back and say, "The troops wonder what they're coming back to. They remember their fathers struggling with unemployment. If we can produce this way for the war, why can't we produce this way for the peace? This is the message the troops asked me, Roosevelt, to bring back to you, that they're not coming back to the old days. They're coming back to a different and new America that is dynamic. Therefore, I propose a second Bill of Rights in the field of economics. The right to a home of your own, the right of a farmer to a piece of land, the right of the businessman to be free from monopoly competition, the right to a doctor when you're sick, the right to a peaceful old age with adequate social security, the right to a decent education." End of quote. FDR read this memo and passed it over to an aide of his with the notation, "What the hell do I do about this?" What indeed. When he returned from Tehran, he made no such stunning speech. Yet he did incorporate Bowles' notion into his annual message to Congress in 1944, where he called, indeed, for an economic Bill of Rights roughly along those lines. Now, given that opening, Bowles suggested that each month between January and July, the President should send over to Congress a legislative proposal involving one of these new rights. Bowles knew that nothing would get done on Capitol Hill, but he felt that by July, Roosevelt would have thereby effectively fashioned a domestic re-election platform, a domestic vision for the post-war era. Again, Roosevelt failed to take up the gauntlet and sent no such bills over to Congress. Worse yet, when he finally accepted nomination for a fourth term, he barely campaigned at all, let alone on a hard-hitting post-war agenda. Now, I think this reflects many things. It reflects his immersion in military affairs and grand strategy, but it also reflects his political instincts, and we now know that some of the internal polling data, as well as the public polling from that time, which basically suggested that if he tried to make this a post-war election, before the fact, admittedly, he would lose. And therefore, for various reasons, he basically skirted around completely Bowles's push along these lines. And so by October 1944, Bowles glumly expected that, and again I'm quoting, FDR would get reelected all right, but with no mandate for the post-war period. In due course, he speculated, the conservatives in both parties would say, and again a quote, "You were elected to win the war, and you've won it. Now shut up." Okay, so yeah, this was a reasonable fear on Bowles's part. Okay, but the CIO, which I'll explain in a moment, would not shut up during its own vigorous campaign for the president's re-election in 1944. So a brief digression to explain what the CIO is. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, arguably the most important development in America of the 1930s, apart from the New Deal. The CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, was initially a self-constituted committee of a few trade union leaders within the AFL. The CIO sought to expand the trade union base by organizing the unorganized in the mass production industries traditionally shunned by the craft unionism of the Federation. Within a few short years, the CIO succeeded beyond its dreams, thanks to various things. A top-down organizing drive in the steel industry, something quite different, a sort of localized bottom-up sit-down, a series of sit-down strikes at auto plants, and parallel to that, New Deal labor laws that modified the rules of the game for unionization. So workers under the aegis of the CIO forged large aggressive unions in the bastions of American heavy industry, steel, autos, rubber, and electrical manufacturing. The AFL as a whole remained cool to this infusion of new style mass unions, so by 1938 the CIO unions had now broken away and formed a new rival federation. By the time America began to rearm in 1940, the major CIO unions had won recognition, contracts, and wage increases from historically resistant industrial giants like U.S. Steel, General Motors, and General Electric. These new unions then prospered on the tide of defense industry expansion as they exchanged a patriotic no-strike pledge for maintenance of membership agreements that effectively kept their ranks growing. Now, the CIO had also embarked on a new political path, discarding the traditional non-political posture of American craft trade unionism in the style of Samuel Gompers, who believed that what politicians gave they could take away. That's the basic rationalization. So instead, by 1936, the CIO conspicuously identified itself as an element of the New Deal coalition. There are some buts and maybes about this. The founding father, John L. Lewis of the coal miners, had, by 1940, broken with Roosevelt over foreign policy issues. He was anti-war isolationist, and he took his union out of the CIO. He was replaced by a man called Philip Murray, who had been his lieutenant, really. The heartbreaking personal story of the struggle between these two. But anyway, Murray became he was the head of the steelworkers already, and he became the head of the CIO. And the third figure in all this, Sidney Hillman, a founding father of the CIO, was a social democrat of long standing. Now, Murray and Hillman were avid Roosevelt supporters by the time we're talking about. And with Lewis gone and politics beginning to percolate up again with the election of 1944 on the horizon, the CIO was able to raise its political profile substantially. The Federation and its constituent unions created what they called, ironically, a political action committee, a PAC, just when the New Deal liberals seemed to be overwhelmed by a conservative coalition in Congress. The CIO PAC was dedicated to re-electing Roosevelt for a fourth term in 1944, but also to campaign against notorious congressional reactionaries and in favor of a few liberal congressional candidates. The CIO PAC could draw on the matrix of national unions and state and city CIO councils, and there was a burst of electoral activity. Now let me go back to the visuals here. First of all, here is Roosevelt and Murray with the patriotic CIO steelworkers. This is a piece of patriotic kitsch, you could easily say, but it evokes part of the sort of atmosphere, at least at the top, of what was going on, of the political symbiosis. More importantly, the CIO PAC for the 1944 election registered new voters, generated pamphlets, flyers, and radio broadcasts, and worked to get out the vote on election day. And here are just a couple of posters, a poster in one case, a poster flyer in the other case. This was the sort of thing the CIO was doing in great volume. And it produced a burst of electoral activism that really was, in effect, coming from the left wing of the New Deal coalition. And in the process of this campaign, the CIO crystallized a progressive vision for post-war America. This came in a document called the People's Program for 1944. It was the CIO's capstone manifesto. It began at a conference that it convened in June. It was first distributed to 12,000 union locals, but it then entered the general election campaign. Now, and this is Sidney Hillman and Philip Murray at sort of the top of the... They have to begin by saying, you know, there's a Republican Party platform, there's a Democratic Party platform, but this is our platform. I can leave that up. I hope you wouldn't be too distracted by it. This is a lot of boilerplate in that part of it. The People's Program opened with lavish praise for Roosevelt, but focused on the unfulfilled agenda of the New Deal as the CIO imagined it. The link to Roosevelt, though, remains central because the wellspring of this program was, in fact, the Economic Bill of Rights that I've already talked about, which was now gathering dust, basically, on a White House shelf after it was presented in January of 1944. And now the CIO PAC resurrected it as the inspiration for its campaign. So the manifesto demanded jobs for all with adequate wages, decent housing to the people at a cost within their means, provision for all of adequate medical care, equality of educational opportunity, and improved protection along the existing lines of social security. Now, to achieve such security and dignity and well-being, the CIO PAC, like the CNR, insisted on what it called planning for plenty. We reject as false that there is a conflict between the planned nationalization of our national resources and genuine free enterprise. So here we are at the idiomatic American quality here, free enterprise. This is not something that you heard in the CNR manifesto. So national planning, planned utilization of resources not incompatible with free enterprise. The CIO called for a kind of tripartite national planning board, but unlike the CNR, it did not advocate nationalization. However, it did call for government to act as an employer of last resort should private industry, free enterprise, fail to maintain full employment. There was an additional proposal in the People's Program that reflects the trade union provenance of this manifesto. In order to sustain purchasing power, which to the progressive mind everywhere was one of the keys to avoiding a depression and having a just society. In order to sustain purchasing power, the CIO argued for what they call a guaranteed annual wage. Now, they understood that the government, at least in the U.S., could not enact this proposal, but it could encourage the incorporation of a guaranteed annual wage into collective bargaining agreements. I mean, this is one of the great American trade union ideas that, in effect, came at this time and then, by a decade later, went. It was gone. But for a while, it was a tenable idea to put forward. With the prospect of post-war reconversion on the horizon, the People's Program espoused the temporary continuation of wartime price controls after the peace, strong commitment to progressive taxes and public works, and it addressed the need of other constituencies such as farmers for price support, small businesses for credit, emphasized various programs for returning servicemen and women, which was already becoming part of a national consensus on that particular area. Education figured prominently in the People's Program of the CIO. Federal grants of various kinds to help equalize inequalities, and new programs for daycare and preschooling. Finally, in the section headed Civil Rights, the CIO PAC supported two modest but still contentious anti-discrimination proposals of that particular time. A permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was toothless at this time, but nonetheless was a first step towards trying to rein in employment discrimination against what were called at that time Negroes, and also an anti-poll tax law that would have concerned 8 southern states. So that is the People's Program of the CIO in 1944. Finally, let us recross the Atlantic and talk about the Labor Party. Now, the Labor Party had helped oust Neville Chamberlain and had entered a coalition government under Churchill in May 1940. For Labor, this was a delicate balance of self-imposed restraint and potential, but very rarely used leverage on the numerically dominant Tories. Attlee essentially agreed to play by Churchill's rule. Everything for the war, whether controversial or not, and nothing controversial that is not bona fide needed for the war. To a degree, one could argue that Roosevelt played by the same rule, and at least at the outset so did de Gaulle, but that's another matter. The coalition's division of labor left military and diplomatic matters entirely to Churchill, as you might recall, but two key home front domains went to the trade union titan and Labor Party titan Ernest Bevin at the Ministry of Labor, and Herbert Morrison, perhaps not as well admired in historiography, at the Home Office, where his brief included the all-important civil defense sector. Now, this is the most iconic classic photograph, but it shows you basically the public face of labor. I mean, there's Churchill, but the public face of labor in the first rank, and that's another of Churchill's rather diminutive cronies at the end of the front rank on the right. But the three labor figures in the center, rolling up their sleeves, are Attlee, Ernest Bevin, and Herbert Morrison. And this is a very classic cartoon by Lowe, reproduced everywhere. This was the public face of labor, particularly Bevin and Morrison, with their great common touch, creativity, and intense patriotism. Now, as foreseen, after VE Day finally arrived, this remarkable coalition government came to an end despite talk about prolonging it until victory in the Pacific. So on May 23rd, 1945, Churchill called for a general election for July of that year. It would be the first general election in 10 years in Britain. Now, by coincidence, the annual Labor Party conference was meeting at Blackpool around that time in an atmosphere that was already electric with excitement over the post-war future. This is another iconic photograph of, in this case, the Labor Party Congress. It shows young Major Dennis Healy, a well-known student, Oxford student radical before the war, briefly a member of the Communist Party, but that really wasn't that wasn't his commitment. Coming back, just back from Italy, where he had seen several years of very active service in uniform, addressing the delegate throngs with a kind of socialist fire and brimstone, which I don't have time to cite, but it made quite a stir. The party's platform, which had been worked up and ready for this, it was called Let Us Face the Future. It entirely left behind the spirit of wartime bipartisanship. And instead it began with a bitter historical prologue, reminding voters that after World War I, the people had lost the peace, that post-war reconversion left too much power in the hands of too few people with no sense of responsibility for the nation. The manifesto turned a famous phrase of Churchill's about the RAF to Labor's account by stigmatizing the interwar years in this way: never was so much injury done to so many by so few. During World War II, on the other hand, Labor's presence had ensured at least an approximation of what it had been calling fair shares as a moral basis for the struggle, and it assured policies that took the profit out of war. Now loomed the daunting challenge of the post-war transition, with the Tories ready to scrap wartime controls and guarantee, in Labor's words, a profiteer's paradise. Let Us Face the Future demanded continued public controls and planning. The sphere of public action must be extended with a firm, constructive hand on our whole productive machinery and a plan which will win the peace for the people. As in the CNR and CIO programs, Labor linked the goal of full employment to the Keynesian notion that underconsumption caused depressions and unemployment. Full employment could be assured only by maintaining purchasing power and rationally channeling the investment of capital. As a socialist party, the Labor went further. By 1937, it had adopted a targeted program for nationalizations without really spelling out the precise modalities. And in 1942, it had tried but failed to have the coalition government nationalize the coal mines. And yet, at its 1944 conference, the year before, a fierce debate had occurred on whether to backpedal on this commitment to nationalization. Labor's executive committee, quite powerful in the party, in fact recommended that cautious move. But uncharacteristically, a floor fight erupted and it was overruled in an open floor vote. So by 1945, it was full sail ahead without reservations about the basic program of nationalization. Each industry must have applied to it the test of national service. And in particular, the Bank of England, coal mines, electric and gas utilities, railroads, inland transportation, and iron and steel production were the established list. A very high priority in the Labor Party platform of 1945 was housing and health care. The program was extremely vague about this, despite the priority standing of these issues. The manifesto did call housing a great test to come because of the destruction of the war and the legacy of pre-war deterioration in the housing stock. And it did call for the allocation of scarce building materials by the state, which was a crucial and contentious policy as far as it went, but it didn't go all that far. And the program had a little more to say about that. The program said that the best health services should be available free for all people, but basically its plan for a national health service remained entirely vague at this point. Pragmatically, the party had decided that it would not bind itself in advance to specific ways of working out these two pledges about housing and health care, even while its candidates were urged to emphasize those issues. Of course, we all know what happened, that when Nye Bevan becomes, oddly enough, the minister who has both these portfolios of housing and national health service to come, the latitude is very good for him. It gives him more maneuvering room, and he more than fully fulfills these pledges, but he could do it in his own way. So that was a virtue of the lack of specificity. Nonetheless, Labor's program in general comes together quite forcefully. It calls for great national programs, quoting that phrase, to promote health, education, and social services in place of the mean and shabby treatment historically occurring under the Tories. Now, such programs would assuredly be costly, and in some ways the following sentence that I'm going to quote is the most interesting in the light of where we stand. These programs would be costly, but, quote, there is no good reason why Britain should not afford them. But she will need full employment and the highest possible industrial efficiency in order to do so. So Labor's program, much like the CIO and the CNR, entwines the notions of social justice and dignity with the advance of economic growth via greater productivity, planning, and controls that can alone could assure that direction. Now, by almost any measure, it seems to me, let us face the future. The Labour Party program ran parallel to the CNR's vision of the post-war future of France and the CIO's vision for a reinvigorated New Deal. If there was a socialist core in the French and British programs, it was decidedly non-Marxist and not rigorous, and designed in both cases to appeal to a broad cross-section of citizens. The watchwords and goals of all three progressive manifestos were comparable. On the social side, equity, security, and dignity. On the economic side, planning and a measure of state control to sustain employment and promote efficiency. There is the issue that nationalization occurs only in the French and British versions, but in the end, I don't think nationalization made that big a difference in the long run. It arguably enhanced economic efficiency and redistributed some political power, but it really had no fundamental social impacts on either the workers in those sectors or on the mass of, let's say, consumers apart beyond the margins. Okay. So in the time remaining, let me turn then to the post-war moment itself. Obviously, the wartime experiences of these three countries different profoundly, but from 1943 onward, Britain, the U.S., and Free France were fighting shoulder to shoulder in the name of democracy, despite some famous antipathies, imbroglios, and tantrums, which I needn't go into. The three manifestos point us to a reservoir of progressive, modestly transformational sentiment, stoked by the protracted popular sacrifice in battling the fascist Axis to victory. The impetus for post-war transformation, I think, proved to be meteoric in character, that is to say, intense, dramatic, but short-lived. And yet it did produce lasting, if distinctive, impacts in the three societies that in turn helped shape their character in the second half of the 20th century in both their underlying similarities as well as differences. Now, the emblematic event of the post-war moment was the Labour Party's decisive victory in the election of 1945. A solid 48% plurality of British voters embraced Labour's appeals and brusquely dismissed their still immensely popular post-war leader. He was not the man for the post-war in the judgment of the British electorate. So out of this comes an expansive Beveridge-style welfare state with a new national health service at its center, a substantial public housing program that emphasized rentals and local council control, which was not self-evident that either of those two things should be the dominant framework, but they were. And here are, again, characteristic pictures of Nye Bevan operating in those two spheres at the brief moment of, shall we say, his greatest success. There was also the equitable handling of severe post-war scarcities and austerity through continued rationing. On the other hand, the great need of Britain to import food and materials and the lack of dollars and gold reserves to pay for them put the Attlee government into a vise. Now, I'm giving you just a sort of leapfrogging to my own sense that they handled this dire situation with an impressive adherence to their own priorities and values, punctuated by occasional bouts of indecision and ineptitude. The Attlee government never managed to fashion the comprehensive planning mechanisms that it deemed vital, but it did achieve a reasonable approximation of what some call an economic general staff in Whitehall. Then in early 1948, the menace of a destructive wage price inflationary spiral really hit hard, deriving from this combination of full employment and scarcity of consumer goods. And the Attlee government basically stepped up to this quite ably and effectively. They won adherence from the Trade Unions Council for what was called a government formula for wage restraint, a wages policy, as it was called, despite the traditional and bedrock TUC, Trade Union Congress, commitment to unimpeded collective bargaining. And these are a couple of cartoons, forget the top image, that sort of try to evoke that problem of how they're combating this problem of a wage price spiral. The second one is obviously a more cutting version of this. But nonetheless, for better than a year, this succeeded. It got them over the worst part of this problem and controlled. In other words, it controlled inflation to a significant extent. There was another problem with the trade unions about dockers' strikes, and the government in 1950 felt that these were going to cripple the economy. These were wildcat strikes, and basically the cabinet, almost without dissent, sent in soldiers to unload the cargo in a blatant and effective form of strike breaking. But that's in effect a side issue to the larger picture. But by 1950, one way or the other, an aging, ailing, and divided Labor Party leadership began to waver and fracture. The resulting rift in the party between Nye Bevan and his followers on one side and the old guard, which would soon come to be replaced by, in effect, their standard bearer would be Hugh Gateskill. This rift was very serious and is evoked in this cartoon, which does it better than I can. And certainly that rift around 1950 was the end of the post-war moment in Britain. Now then, the question, though, remains, the Conservatives coming back to power finally in 1951, what does it tell us then about the achievement of the Labour Party? And there are extreme positions, by the way, in English historiography, I think, or British historiography, more even than in the United States and France about this type of question. One position held at a certain time in the 50s that basically the Labour government sold out real socialism. The name associated with this is Ralph Miliband, who happened to be the father of the current leaders of the Labour Party. Another extreme position on the other side said that the Labour government basically destroyed any chance the British economy had for success in the future. This is a man called Corelli Barnett. More worthy of attention, though, is an interesting argument by Paul Addison, who said that a reform consensus took place during the wartime coalition that basically brought together moderate elements of both the major parties. And Addison argued that this prepared the ground for the Attlee government on the one side and then precluded an abrupt change of course after 1951. Well, the problem with this sort of thing, though, is that eventually a younger generation of historians comes along and they challenge us and have convincingly, I think, argued that this consensus, as Addison called it, was more myth than reality. Nonetheless, the Churchill government in 1951 inherited what you might call a settlement coming out of the Attlee government. Okay. And indeed, it had some roots in the coalition years of World War II. But to my mind, the forms and the transformational heft of this settlement derive from Labor's social democratic agenda, from its decisive victory in 1945 and the way it exercised power, which, against the odds, fulfilled most of its platform. Now, across the Channel, the election of a Constituent Assembly in October 1945, which brought the promised return to electoral democracy. Until that election, for 14 months, de Gaulle's unelected provisional government headed France for those months. Now, his top priorities were the reestablishment of state power and the rank of France as a great power. We all know that. He rarely referred to the CNR program of March 1944, but he did share its commitment to renewal and what he called peaceful revolution, which was the common language of the resistance to what they were looking forward to. During a triumphal visit to Lille and the northern departments in October 1944, shortly after they had been liberated, he explicitly, on that occasion, embraced the CNR commitment to economic and social democracy, to national planning, and to economic intervention. Now, economic intervention. My serendipitous kind of research brought to light something that I doubt any other French historian has ever seen or even thought of. This is clippings of red baiting against the CIO, but somehow in the middle of this, look at this editorial here. This is from the rabidly reactionary Hearst newspapers, this one in New York. De Gaulle, in his true color, red, claiming that while he did not advocate out-and-out communism, he was, and this is you could see some journalist creating this word, he was Trojan horsing communist-like objectives in his Lille speech, which was basically the CNR program. An amazing point of view about de Gaulle. In any case, though, his provisional government then began implementing elements of the CNR program relating to nationalization, social security, with a very peculiar French spin that Phil Nord has recently summarized, I think, very effectively in his book on France's New Deal, as he calls it, and also mechanisms for worker participation. The elections of 1945, first municipal and cantonal, and then finally in October of 1944, a general election for the Constituent Assembly, produced a lot of sharp elbows and jostling. But this provisional this Constituent Assembly still named de Gaulle as their prime minister. This was on the first day of its meeting. It's a very interesting picture because the front government benches are still empty. There is no government yet, but the Constituent Assembly, a couple of days later, was going to name de Gaulle, who would in turn name his ministers. But as everyone knows, the general really could not abide any political challenge of any serious kind that he couldn't manage, and eventually, after only 3 months, he resigned. Temporarily, he thought, and left the political stage. So then we move full scale, although it had been the case up to now as well, but with de Gaulle, the period of tripartite government. The three major post-war parties coming out of this election cycle, the Communists, the Socialists, and the new party of Social Catholics, the MRP, whose leaders had all been prominent in the resistance, all three parties at this point in time, 1940, late 45 through the next couple of years, stood very explicitly on the CNR common program. They drew roughly equal number of votes at first, although the socialists faded quickly after a year. They shared power. They completed a new constitution on their second try after great acrimony. They governed effectively without de Gaulle for a while, and eventually they fell out. Hypernormal politics is what France had for 2 years, because there were just an endless series of election referenda and more elections. that coincided with the fading of resistance fantasies about maintaining a united political front free of old political parties and their partisanship. The nadir for the resistance came in July 1945 with this very interesting notion, État généraux de la Renaissance française. Just keep your eye again on this figure in the middle. You've seen him before a couple of times. It was none other than Louis Saillant, who had become the head of the CNR and was very important in the CGT, and was at the helm of this conference, which failed miserably. It was much touted, and it basically accomplished nothing. And that, in some ways, became the swan song for this notion of the resistance as in itself a political force in in France. There was great acrimony between the MRP and the communists, particularly across the electoral cycles of 1946. And de Gaulle turned brutally against the Fourth Republic as it finally came out without his influence. This sapped but did not extinguish the resistance impetus for post-war transformation embraced by the tripartite governments and based on the CNR program. In other words, the resistance as a political force really fades, but its program remains a kind of bedrock of the early post-war years of tripartite government. So you get a nationalized sector, a limited but highly effective form of economic planning, less effective combating of inflation than went on in Britain, but you do get a battle for production that both Britain and France desperately need to get them back on their feet. That was it's a form of unity for 2 years, the battle for production. The communists, for example, are very good about supporting this and in effect renouncing excessive wage demands and things like that. But eventually the patience of workers with this sort of thing runs out, and a wave of strikes propelled by rank-and-file workers erupts, and it forces the unions to catch up, and in particular the communists are now basically have taken over the CGT. So the Communist Party and the CGT become very strongly intertwined, and the communist ministers are then expelled from the government in May 1947. The strike waves continue, and they're suppressed by socialist ministers like Paul Ramadier and Jules Moch, and that basically marks the end of the post-war moment in France. So in the 5 minutes remaining to me, I have to say something then about the United States. FDR, when the post-war comes, is of course gone. His New Deal coalition seems to be almost moribund, except that the progressive wing is re-energized. You have the CIO PAC, you have the American Veterans Committee, which is in effect battling against the conservative American Legion, and you have the CIO itself spoiling for a fight with an equally belligerent and self-confident business community, big business community in America, whose mantra is the right to manage. So no battle, no sort of self-abnegating battle for production in the United States. No resistance to wage increases here. The CIO is really ready to go to the mat with big business. And there is a strike wave too in the United States, but it plays out in a different way. And in the end, it proves the capacity and staying power of these new industrial unions, which did very well for their members going forward. But meanwhile, several items in the People's Program move forward in Congress and go down to defeat. The Conservative Coalition guts Truman's quasi-Keynesian full employment bill into a hollow shell. The Senate passes a very ambitious public housing bill, the Wagner-Taft-Ellender housing bill, which with major provisions for new low-cost public housing, but the builders' lobby and rural congressmen defeated in the House. Then comes the first post-war election, a congressional election in 1946, and it's a Republican landslide, as we all know. And we also know that the singular monument of this Republican Congress is the anti-union Taft-Hartley labor law of 1947, which is carried over Truman's veto. the Taft-Hartley law reins in certain trade union strike tactics. It also precipitated great internal conflicts in the CIO itself because it required all union officials to formally avow that they were not communists. And there were plenty of communists in the CIO. At this point, let me say that both in Britain and France, the trade unions are, in a sense, one of the front lines in the emerging battle in 1947 and after between communists and anti-communists in those three countries. And here, again, is Louis Saillant, who is emerging as very important in the CGT, who had been a socialist, a young disciple of Léon Jouot, the socialist warhorse in the CGT, but who is gradually moving away from that and swings over to the communist side and is, let us say, becomes a full-scale fellow traveler. I think Saillant is actually a very important figure because in a negative sense, he was in a very strategic position, I think, to either be a broker or to somehow navigate through these issues, and instead he's besotted by the communist appeal at that time, which obviously many voters and non-communists were, but he in a sense should have known better, I think, and therefore squandered his tremendous leverage. And by 1953, he's the head of the World Federation of Trade Unions, which is from which the Americans and British are long gone. It's basically a communist front. And you read what he's writing. I mean, he's just mouthing communist platitudes, although with the more important message maybe of anti-imperialism. But there's no biography that I know of Louis Saillant. I think he's an immensely important figure. And as I say, my provisional view would be that he does not make use of this the great strategic position he had come to through his resistance work, his trade union work, and his political work after the liberation. And there it is. But in any case, that's a sidebar. Taft-Hartley, we haven't finished with it. It reins in strike tactics. It basically helps drive communists out of the trade unions. But it also authorized the 48 states to pass right-to-work laws, which is very different from the French tradition of the right-to-work. Right-to-work laws means you don't have to join a union. Many states in the South and some elsewhere enacted these laws. They all but banned union shops. They made trade union organizing extremely difficult. And in the South, they effectively derailed most efforts to unionize black workers. Taft-Hartley, though, was not a stake in the heart of the trade unions in America. Indeed, in the next decade would appear as a kind of golden age, in retrospect, for America's unionized industrial workers. At least that's the way we talk about it now. They did very well for the members of their unions. But, as critics have rightly said, Taft-Hartley was a slow-acting poison, that's not my phrase, but it's a very good one, on the long-term growth and health of American trade unions, a case that you can find in the literature if you look for it. But I should say that the reversal did not go much further. As we all know, an unsteady President Truman sort of found his rhythm, rebounded, and under a quasi-New Deal mantle, won re-election by attacking the very Congress of 1946. Now, my point would simply be that many domestic battles remain to be waged. Some, possibly most, were lost to the persisting conservative forces in Congress, as over national health insurance, which Truman pushed, or an extension of FEPC, anti-discrimination in employment. Those went down to defeat, but others were won. A delayed victory for public housing in 1949, a rise in the federal minimum wage, and a modest rise in Social Security. And finally, Truman's desegregation order, executive order for the armed forces. So across the early post-war years in America, neither conservative normalcy nor progressive change held a clear upper hand. And that brings me now to my conclusion. Someday I hope to sort all this out in greater detail, both the similarities and differences in the domestic experiences of these three victorious allies during the post-war years, roughly 1944-45 to roughly 1950-51. Okay. But whatever the balance proves to be between similarity and difference, my project entails a reservation about the implicit claims for exceptionalism, either pro or con, that you find embedded both in the historiographical and civic traditions of each of these three Western democracies. I could easily have subtitled this talk An Argument Against Exceptionalism, and I hope I've made this case in two respects. First, mainly on the content and import of these three progressive manifestos. Each is familiar in national historiography, but they have never been aligned, let alone discussed, with emphasis on their common aspirational themes and on their roots in the prospect of Allied victory in the preceding struggle. Secondly, I hope I've made the case against exceptionalism, maybe less compellingly, on the passage into and out of the post-war moment in the three democracies. My comment would be that the political conflicts ran parallel, even if the specific contexts, the registers, the protagonists, and the time frames differed. The most obvious commonality lay in the simple fact of being democracies, where alternations of political power through elections are almost inevitable. In any case, in France, the US, and Britain, each ended up with decidedly conservative governance by 1951-52. So how the progressive legacies fared going forward in these three countries becomes another question for another occasion. Thank you.